Welcome to our discussion of civil liberties. This week we will have two brief PowerPoints, one on civil liberties and the other on civil rights. To talk about both of these things, we need to define what they are, both in relation to each other and in general. Civil liberties are different than civil rights. Civil liberties are these fundamental freedoms that protect people from tyranny. That's your book's definition, but maybe a better definition is the freedoms guaranteed to individuals with respect to government action. In other words, they restrict government from doing something. Civil liberties are available to everyone, and they are fundamental in that they arguably existed prior to the Constitution. They are based on this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property or happiness, depending on who you talk to. And so the difference between civil liberties and civil rights involves whether the government is acting or refraining from acting. And civil liberties is refraining from acting, keeping the government out of your ability to act or do something or not do something. Whereas civil rights is the government acting to preserve the rights of citizenship that you have. So civil liberties represent our liberal tradition and norms. If you go back to John Locke and that discussion, that's what civil liberties are. Civil rights represent more of a Republican tradition. So we protect the civil liberties in the country based off of our Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, the term is somewhat confusing because it's not necessarily rights, but it's a right to a liberty. And so our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, was drafted by James Madison, as you may recall, after the Anti-Federalists raised a concern over the fact that we didn't have such protection in our Constitution. And for a long time, that protection was limited to the federal government. States did not have to be bound by the same restrictions. This changed with the 14th Amendment. That was one of those Civil War amendments. And that started to implement the process of selective incorporation. And selective incorporation is where the court started applying the Bill of Rights to the states. And not all at once. Sometimes it would be search and seizure, and other times it would be freedom of speech. But selective incorporation is when the Supreme Court began applying the Bill of Rights to the states after the adoption of the 14th Amendment. So, briefly then, what are some major categories of civil rights, or excuse me, of civil liberties? And the first is freedom of expression and assembly, freedom of speech. This is embodied in the First Amendment, and it protects the ability to speak. But what does this include? Well, first, it's important to know that the freedom of speech is part of this fundamental freedoms doctrine. And that just merely means that there are some freedoms so fundamental to our society that they supersede even the Constitution itself. So things like speech and assembly is one of those. For a long time, freedom of speech was this idea of prior restraint, that the government cannot stop you from speaking, but it could potentially punish you for speaking. And this has been broadened significantly over the past century to incorporate many forms of content-based restrictions, so that the government cannot stop you or punish you from speaking, not just stop you. And the government is not powerless to restrict speech. Many people think, well, the freedom of speech means I can say whatever I want without any repercussions. Well, first of all, it's important to know that you need a government actor stopping you for the First Amendment to apply. If someone else is stopping you that is not a government actor, the First Amendment is not even relevant. But the governments can restrict time, place, and manner. So while you may have a right to protest and use a bullhorn to make your protests heard, you don't have the right to walk down a residential street at 3 in the morning making your protests heard on a bullhorn. So the government can act in order to enforce when, where, and how speech is given. It just can't restrict it. And there is some speech that lacks protection. Commercial speech is not fully protected. We do allow regulations on commercial speech selling things in order to protect consumers. Defamatory statements are not protected. Obscenity, pure obscenity, is not protected. And fighting words or incitement are not protected. The famous example is that you will not be protected if you yell fire in a crowded theater, because that has direct ramifications. Another fundamental freedom in our First Amendment is the freedom of religion. And there's two broad clauses that protects this freedom of religion. The first is the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from establishing a national religion or becoming too entangled with religion. So there are two parts to this: separation and neutrality. Separation meaning government must exist in a separate sphere from religion, and neutrality meaning that government cannot encourage or discourage religious beliefs or practices. And then the second clause is the Free Exercise Clause. It prohibits government from restricting citizens' involvement with religion. In other words, it cannot restrict your right to exercise your religious beliefs. And for most of our history, up until about a year ago, that only covered individuals and obviously churches. But after the Hobby Lobby case, which extended the right of freedom of religion to closely held for-profit corporations, there has been some expansion of that freedom. Right to privacy, or freedom from government intrusion, is an interesting case. It is an implied right. There is no amendment in the Constitution that says you have the right to privacy. However, in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut in 1963, the court said that there was a right to privacy. And this case involved punishment for a state law that banned contraceptives. And the court said that there exists rights outside of the Bill of Rights. So first, we have the Ninth Amendment that says not all of the rights listed in the Bill of Rights are exclusive, meaning there are other rights involved. We're just not listing them all here. But also that there's this penumbra of rights. And a penumbra means kind of an overarching umbrella term built into the Bill of Rights that rely on a right to privacy. So if you have the right to remain silent or the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, then you have the right to privacy that is built off on. So this is a newer legal interpretation, but it is certainly important in our day-to-day lives. And then we have several amendments in the Bill of Rights on the that protect the criminally accused or convicted. And there are people from time to time, especially during a high-profile criminal case, that ask why we have these protections. And that's because it was the desire of the founders to have them. If you recall from our early discussions in the semester, these are people who were scared of the authority of government, and for good reason. Many of them were investigated. They had their homes searched, seized. They had their freedom taken away in some respect, or the threat of that happening. And so they wanted to protect people, not to protect the guilty or to protect criminals, but to protect the innocent, because they believed they were innocent. And so we have two broad categories: the rights of the accused and the rights of the convicted. The rights of the accused will sound very familiar from the Miranda rights if you've ever watched Law and Order or any other cop show. You have the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, meaning the government must have a warrant to search your stuff, or other reasonable suspicion and an exception to a warrant. You have the right to be free from self-incrimination. You have the right not to testify in your own behalf or to speak. You have the right to remain silent. Right to an impartial jury of your peers, right to legal counsel, and freedom from double jeopardy, meaning you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. Now, once you're convicted, you do lose some of your fundamental liberties to move freely and that type of thing. But you have other protections. One is to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, and this is where debates about the death penalty come in. And the other is the right of habeas corpus. You have the right to challenge the actions of the government after you have been tried and convicted on your case. So it's a procedural mechanism that protects people who have been convicted of crimes. And again, our most common perception of this is Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent, which is Fifth Amendment, right to an attorney, and that one will be provided for you if you cannot afford one. And then they ask if you understand these rights, and you have to knowingly waive them. So, that is our quick lecture on civil liberties. I will talk to you about civil rights next.